Hello and welcome to AXSChat. I'm really pleased that we're joined today by Heather Dowdy. Been a fan of Heather's for quite some time. Heather is working at Microsoft in the field of AI for good. So Heather, it's a real pleasure to have you here today. We've had some conversations before around the importance of some of the topics that we need to consider for AI when we're talking about inclusion, but please tell us about you, your role, and how you came to be working in the field of accessibility and inclusion.
Thanks, Neil. Thank you, AXSChat, for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation because I'm excited to talk to our community. There's so much to really talk about when you think about the future of technology. And quite honestly, I come to this work personally and professionally an ally. So I'm a CODA, child of deaf adults. I began sign language at 6 months old. And I was raised by young Black deaf parents on the south side of Chicago. So lots of intersections there. We had all types of technology in our home growing up that helped my parents hear and communicate with others. And I honestly fell in love with what technology could do, which is open up doors, provide access. And I went to school for engineering and was able to fall in love with a career in access technology. I've been in mobile accessibility, web accessibility, and now AI accessibility.
Thank you. And I think it's really important that we accept the contribution of allies and families and that lived experience of working with disabilities from both sides as part of our community, because sometimes there is the tendency to focus on the disability community themselves rather than the wider ecosystems that we all live in, and then let's face it, some of us start off as allies and end up on the other side in the community too. So,
right.
And in fact, if we live long enough, pretty much all of us will. So here at AXSChat, we're definitely, broad church. We want to welcome everyone. So it's great to hear a bit about your background. So, I also spent time in mobile, so I'm still fascinated by mobile, right? Although these days the change is more incremental and it's not quite so revolutionary, but there's still the conduit, if you like, for a lot of the stuff that's happening in AI, actually. So a lot of the stuff that AI is powering, we're experiencing through these things. So yeah, tell us a bit about what you're doing in the AI programs that you're working on and how that's impacting the community.
Well, I also want to comment on what you just said about being an ally. It's so true. We need allies in the accessibility community. I like to think that I have a certain privilege, and privilege isn't necessarily inherently a negative word. It's how you use your privilege. And so having one foot in the deaf world and one foot in the hearing world allows me to observe a lot. And it allows me to comment on a lot. And the reason why I bring that up is because, it's taken some time to realize that is stuck with me throughout my career. I don't get to leave that experience at the door just because I'm talking about a new technology. It stuck with me in mobile when we were looking at hearing aid compatibility to know this is a big game changer, and web accessibility is stuck with me and realizing, wow, we get so much information on the internet. How do we make sure that it's accessible to everyone? And now with AI technology, it's just the newest frontier. So I like to try to stay on the latest frontier when it comes to accessibility. And for me, in looking at AI, you're right. It's a new technology, but the way we approach it is very much the same as any other technology, as mobile and web. And it is to really think about who's at the table, who's participating in designing that technology, who is participating when it comes to making sure that the community understands the impacts, both positive and negative, of a new technology. And so what I love about AI is because it's seen as a disruptor. And quite honestly, I think we need a little bit of that. There are some things, including the unemployment rate in the disability community, that hasn't changed in 30 years in the US since we started counting it. You know, a 50% unemployment rate for 30 years, we got to do something different. And so really, as a community, we need not be afraid of approaching a new technology like AI, just like as we've done with others.
Excellent, and I think that's so true, and those figures are, you know, although I know them, are shocking. You know, that 50% unemployment is not just shocking, but it's unacceptable.
And that was before COVID. Yes. And so during the COVID pandemic, we see that people with disabilities are at the forefront of job losses. So when we think about a really inclusive recovery, what is it going to take? We need to leapfrog. I'm like, let's go, let's leapfrog, and not necessarily try to play catch up.
And Heather, I was listening to your interview the other day on Verizon Media with Margot Jaffe, who I like you, I'm a big fan of her work. And you had talked a little bit, and I also am very blessed to have had you on my show, Human Potential at Work, and where you talked about some of the same themes, but I know you were discouraged by a professor to be an engineer because of the color of your skin. So I do think it's very interesting, and maybe because you were a woman, I don't know, but I think the ally, the accomplice conversation, the intersectionality conversations are just so powerful. And so I love that you are representing our community, representing women, representing African Americans and people that are brown and black. But why is it so important that all of these voices and intersections be considered in these topics? And do you believe that that is really happening?
Wow, great question, Deborah. I love the fact that I can explain parts of my identity through the word intersection, but before I knew that word, it was just my lived experience. It was who I am. And quite honestly, I did have to show up in places and try to cover certain parts or minimize other parts. And that is not working. That is not working to serve the community. That's not working for me every day. And so a lot of my dealing or coming to terms with that really did happen with getting my engineering degree. When I was told by a white woman who was a dean of the college that I would never get my engineering degree from there. I had just finished taking her class in engineering, and I was declaring my major, and she took one look at me and just was like, "You're better off majoring in Caribbean studies," just by one look at me. And so of course, that really pissed me off. And so I went to the minority engineering department and told them what she said. And I was telling this to a Black man that was a dean there. And he looked at me and said, "Well, who told you you're going to be an engineer anyway?" So, you know, to get it from both ends was like, wow, I will show you. But for me, it really grounded me in why I wanted to do this. I knew that I was serving people that looked like my parents. I knew that I had a bigger why, and that really did sustain me. But the reason why that story and stories of intersectional identities are important is because it allows us to see where we could be harming people and where we could be leaving people. Intersectionality shows up in a lot of places. It really does inform how I also perceive people with disabilities. It really does allow me to say, wow, that could be one part of their identity, but there is so much more there. Can we really, you know, get to know the whole person?
Yeah, and I'm obviously very disappointed, but not shocked by your experience. I've come from a different position. I come from a position of privilege in many ways. I come from a middle-class background. I'm white, Anglo-Saxon. At the same time, I was also told not to do things, not to expect things, and that I was a lazy, a dilettante, and why not? Why not? You know, why was I applying to Oxford? So I think that actually the reason we're sat here today is because we were told that we couldn't do stuff as much as that we can do stuff. What I hope is that the message that we all give to people is that don't take no for an answer. If you really believe that you want to do something, follow your passion, because you can do it, because you're the one that determines whether or not you can't. Now, there are systemic barriers, and those barriers are different for different social groups. And so, you know, it's like running the 100 meters and I get a 60-meter head start on you because of where I was born and the color of my skin. But it doesn't mean that you can't complete the 100 meters. What I'd like to do is make sure that we all start from the same place.
Neil, but on that topic, and if we go back to some of the life stories of some of our guests,
yes.
In some cases, the resilience was on the parents' side. If it wasn't for the parents to pursue, say, I don't accept a no as an answer, no, their children wouldn't have a chance of achieving what they were able to achieve and be who they are today.
That's a really great point, Antonio. And I would also add that in my experience, I think about the parents of children and students with disabilities of color from marginalized communities where these parents aren't necessarily privy to understanding what access options there are. And so then you even have a disparity there amongst, okay, which parents understand what resources are available to them because they aren't available to everyone at the same level as they should be. And to me, that really does drive me, particularly in one of my passions in education, that education to employment pipeline. There's so many things there, but if we don't really think about intersectionality or sit with people's stories, we really won't be doing a service to our entire community. I think for so long, as a disability community, we thought, well, if we talk about race, that kind of detracts from disability, or if we focus on this one area, or maybe we should just focus on certain visible disabilities. And that hasn't gotten us as far as we would like. And we can no longer wait until we get to that particular mountaintop to say everybody else should be included as well.
Yeah, so Deborah is on mute. I'm not sure why.
I just on mute because I totally agree with what she's saying. And, you know, there's so many things we've got to figure out when it comes to society, period. But for AIDS specifically, this is a huge undertaking that we're doing as society. And we must have voices like Heather in it. We must. And we must have people like Heather and all of the rest of us fighting for others to come in. But there's so many. I know that before we started the show, Antonio had dropped a link in our little chat box talking about some of these issues. And even last night, Heather, we were teasing you because you look so beautiful today. And you were talking about, what you were looking at last night that actually kept you awake. So there's so many issues that, you know, in some ways they seem like the same issues. It's all about leaving parents out, leaving individuals out, leaving people out. But I know that as a parent, when I was raising my daughter with Down syndrome, there was so much that I didn't have any information. I didn't know where to go. And then we were trying to deal with a very complicated IEP system, individual education program, for example, here in the States. And I felt so sorry for some of my peers that didn't have the same communication skills I had. They didn't have the almost like, you're saying, what are you going to do? Plus also I'm a white woman. So I have a little bit more privilege when it comes to the teachers and influence, sadly. So it's like these societal barriers are so complicated and so entrenched. I mean, it shocks me. It shocks and saddens me that a white woman told you could not be an engineer. It saddens me that a Black man didn't stand with you. So two of your genders, I mean, your gender, two of your peers said, you can't do it. Thank goodness you're strong enough and say, oh, well, let me tell you, watch me do it. And so I'm stubborn like that too. So is Neil. Neil is so stubborn. So is Antonio. You go ahead and tell me I can't do it and then get out of my way, because watch me do it. Watch me do it. But it's not fair. It's not good for society. There's so many reasons why what we're doing to people, because what if you didn't, Heather? What if you didn't have the confidence to say, oh yeah, watch me? But then we would have lost something very valuable. You would have lost, your family would have lost, society loses. So it's chilling what we're doing. And the problem seems so big and overwhelming. Sometimes I'm sure a lot of us feel like, I don't even know where to begin. These problems are just too big.
Oh my goodness. I mean, talking about the education to employment pipeline, particularly, I'm like, what can we do to really make sure that we fill that pipeline, that we really get students with disabilities jobs? But even in that, and talking about some of the systemic barriers, did you know that over 33% of the students that actually fill the school to prison pipeline are Black students with disabilities? So you have that intersection of race and disability there. And you have to we really do have to ask the question, well, why is that? What's happening? How is disability being perceived? Do we understand enough about the intersection of race and disability? And I would also challenge all of us to think that these issues impact us personally. When I don't hear your story, I miss out on the goodness of you and all that you bring and how we connect. And so instead of just thinking about it as a problem over there, it is a problem that affects us as a community.
Yeah. I see Deborah put in the chat 60% of US inmates, and the US has the largest prison population per capita in the world, are people with disabilities. And in the UK, I think the stats are something like 40% of all people in prison are people with learning disability or dyslexia, and I think that the way that the education system is set up and is so inflexible and so structured to going down a certain path makes it very easy for people that aren't meeting a certain neurotype or a racial type or from a socioeconomic background to quickly fall through the gaps. And we not only do we miss out their potential, but we go further than that. We block it, and then we criminalize them through all sorts of things. And I think that there are some people doing really interesting work in the criminal justice system to try and address that. We've obviously had Judge Wren on AXSChat a couple of times. Big fan of Judge Wren, but I'm also aware of the work of Project 507 in the UK, which Whitney Isles, who I know from another thing I do, runs, and she looks at the intersection of trauma and ethnicity in social justice. And that's a whole nother fascinating area. Because trauma informs behavior, informs how people interact with the authorities, and that then causes all sorts of chain reactions to happen. So if you're conditioned because of the social trauma, and trauma can be inherited, because you're from different socioeconomic groups, then you're much more likely to react to authority in a different way, and they're going to assume guilt, and all of these things then impact on people, and they impact on statistics. So statistically, we have all of these things, and those feed into the data that we're feeding into the AI that is now making decisions about our lives.
Yes. Wow. If I can amplify what you said, it's more than we missed out. We're harming people.
Yes. Yeah.
And if I could also amplify what you said in terms of trauma, that's an area that our team was looking at very recently. We published a report on mental health societal bias in the Black communities and AI, and just the potential there. And a lot of what we found out really did have to tie to just racial trauma. And so can we understand mental health conditions through the intersectional identity lens of race? Could there be things there that inform us? And again, that goes to why language matters, because it's like, oh, now you're talking about mental health, the number one disability in the world. That's where it fits into the disability conversation. So I just love everything that you said there, Neil.
Yeah, thank you. I'm immediately jumping to pinging you an email introduction to Whitney whilst we speak.
Do that every time we talk, right? We're like, where do we want to go? And then we get off on this whole thread because there's so much here. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that leads on to the next thing that I'm really interested in. And I seem to be going into really soft focus. I know I've not got my glasses on, but I'm really soft focused today. It's like someone's smeared Vaseline on the lens, which is a good thing for all of you folks watching. It's thinking about if we've got these historical data sets that contain the innate biases of society that then create harm, how do we address that when, and at scale, when you can't necessarily go and suddenly just drag in 3,000 people to start addressing those data sets? So for example, you were talking, I think before we started, we were talking about camera recognition technology, right? And some of the challenges of that. So if most of the data of people doing what are considered normal day-to-day things are, white cishet males, and we need pictures of people of different ethnicities, of different backgrounds, and everything else, can we use things like generative adversarial networks to start, and I know there are experiments going on to try and do this, to start building up images and data sets that are much more diverse? And do you think that that's a valid approach?
Inclusive data sets that are representative of people with disabilities and the lived experience is crucial, because you mentioned that AI runs on data. That is like the one point that I tend to land with AI. I also land why we want to use AI. We don't necessarily need a hammer where it's AI everything, but really think about why we're using the technology. And at its core, AI is technology that processes lots of data, whether images or audio, and allows us to make decisions. It shouldn't replace humans. It should complement our decision making. And so if we really think about that framework, we really have to think about, okay, some of the design justice principles when it comes to developing AI responsibly. Who is harmed? Who benefits? And who's participating? Because that also lets you know who's being excluded. As we say in the community, if you're not included, you're excluded. And so those design justice principles are a lens that can be applied to everything. And when it comes to lots of technology, particularly in focus on AI technology, it's important that we do have a balance of privacy and transparency when collecting data, because quite honestly, our community can be a little bit fearful. Well, what do you need that data for? And is it going to trace back to me specifically as a person living with a disability? But what I want to counter with that is that we can be transparent on how the data is being used and how it's collected. But I have to land that we have to collect more inclusive data sets. We need the community that already has the inherent trust to be able to collect those data sets, because that is what's going to help voice assistants, for instance, recognize impacted speech. People living with cerebral palsy, for example. We need more data. We need those models trained on inclusive data sets for sure.
Heather, I know that Antonio has a question, but I was tracking, what was happening with TikTok in the United States and the politics and stuff. But I remember when Microsoft said they were going to buy the American version of TikTok, I was just sort of surprised as an individual. And I was thinking, wonder why Microsoft wants TikTok. But then I read this very interesting article about it. And they said the reason why and I don't know what happened if Microsoft did buy it, but the reason why Microsoft was intrigued with TikTok was because of all those data sets out there. And that I just was fascinated by. And because I thought, well, because we are telling TikTok who we are by all those cute little things we're doing, right? So I was just so fascinated, and I didn't know if you wanted to comment. And I know once again, Antonio also has a question, but I wanted to just throw that out real quick because it seemed timely to where you were in the conversation.
TikTok was addictive. I had to pause it because I like learning, and it's a way to just really get these really nice tidbits in 1 to 2 minutes. And it's really engaging. I have to say that for a lot of reasons. But I do think that we have to get creative about where we get data sets from because we need scale, which is something Neil mentioned. When you think about voice recognition that's been trained on billions of data points, and you compare that to perhaps, voice recognition for people with impacted speech, like I said, or even sign language, we're talking about much smaller data sets. And the more data that we train AI on, the more accurate and confident it is, and so it's just important for us to get creative at how we do it at scale. But I don't think that should paralyze us as a community from starting to figure out how we can collect data sets that are inclusive today.
Now, following on that conversation of data sets, we've seen startups trying to come into this space, trying to make AI more robust and more reliable. But even so, we are talking about systems. I can tell you a story. When I was studying sociology, there was a program very well known at the time called SPSS. So we were using that for analytics and to graphics and to do a lot of research in relation to the data that we were collecting. But sometimes when we were at university, we had deadlines. And we have to conduct surveys to different groups and institutions. And I have cases in my colleagues where people were on a rush to complete a task or to deliver a certain number of service, where they end up filling the service themselves in behalf of other people because they needed to provide some details and some information to the teacher. And then they were feeding the technology, in this case, the analytic tool SPSS, with that data. So there was nothing wrong with the tool itself. The method and the approach, that's where the problem was. Okay, so I feel that we are building all these solutions. We are using engineers developing systems, but the root cause is a little bit different. Sometimes it's not even relate with the technology itself. So and knowing as well that sometimes some of these systems are delivered by people from a computer science background who are focused on targets, on, I really need to deliver something, I need to be productive. How can we make sure that, the other components that are somehow in what I call area of where computer engineers are not scalable, knowledgeable in terms of the social aspects of it, how can we fill this knowledge gap that exists here in order to avoid mistakes?
Great question, Antonio. And a lot of that is, again, who's at the table, who's participating. And that's why I'm so passionate about education, because we need more people with disabilities who are entering into data science fields and other fields that leverage AI to be at the table to really make sure that we have and deliver an inclusive experience. And I will also say what I'm encouraged by when I look at AI and through my experience in the field is that there is room for inclusive teams. It's not just computer scientists and data scientists at the table, but sometimes we have linguists at the table and psychologists at the table. And I love that type of diversity of thought because, sometimes that means that, hey, you're going to slow down a little bit naturally because everyone is not thinking homogeneously, which is not a negative thing, but you're going to have a better experience and outcome as a result. But again, we really do need more people with disabilities in this field.
Yeah.
Yes, agree.
So, you just mentioned about homogeneity, and that is something that AI tends to focus on. It's looking for commonalities, and yet diversity is the opposite. So how do we approach using AI and creating AI that can recognize the benefits of stuff at the edge? Because what it tends to do is filter out and look for the middle ground. And actually we're at the extremes quite often. And some of the most beneficial things come from understanding the extremes, because when you include the edges, you're building for everyone and for the center. But that's how do we fundamentally redesign our approach to AI? That's a big question. I'm sorry for that.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth, right? You gave me the question and then you labeled it a big question. I'm not mad at you, Neil. It is a big question and one of my favorite questions because it's what we call balancing intelligence, based on history with the future, with discovering something new. So you're right. At its core, fundamentally, AI is modeling based on historical data. But history hasn't always served marginalized communities, including people with disabilities, well. So do we really want to repeat history by modeling based on historical data? And the answer is, it really depends. And that's why we really have to remember that using AI technologies is supposed to complement our decision making. So if we can learn insights about root causes and perhaps where, for instance, people with disabilities get stuck in that employment pipeline, can we then use that to build something new, but not necessarily replicate what's been done in the past?
Excellent point. And I guess then, some of it comes down to explainability of AI, right? And AI explainability is a big topic because for most people, this stuff happens in a black box. It's not transparent as to what's happening or how decisions are being taken. Yes. So especially when it comes to systems that make decisions that can affect your life. So, your things that qualify you for insurance, for Medicare, for deciding whether or not you meet the cut for a job. Do you think that there is work still needed to regulate or to build frameworks for this that companies and countries and organizations need to adopt?
I think frameworks are extremely important. We have to talk about what we're doing with the data, particularly when it comes to the disability community. Me walking up to you on the street and say, give me your social and your height and all of these other things, you should want to know what I'm going to do with that data. And I should be able to explain, as you said, in a way that honors your privacy and in a transparent way. And so the responsible framework that Microsoft has is one that we firmly believe is important when really considering how to deploy the technology, which is why you see Microsoft kind of have to reassess things once they're in the field and they are used differently than how we intended for it to be designed. And so that again goes back to a responsible AI framework, because with any technology, you design it once and then sometimes it has a life of its own. And so how do you control that? But if you really do kind of put those things in place in the beginning within that responsible framework or responsible AI framework, you can begin to continue to have the conversation. You cannot just develop it and leave it. You have to continue to evaluate and have the conversation of how it's being used after it's deployed.
Well said. And I have a quick question to ask you, Heather, and Neil as well, and Antonio. I don't know if he wants to comment, and I know we're almost out of time, but I'd had a conversation with you, Heather. I've had a lot of really brilliant conversations with you. And one thing that you were talking to me about was, how can corporations help the community of people with disabilities? Because often when we're business owners and things like that, we don't really even know how to pitch what we're doing to corporations. And so we know that we want the community involved, but what role can a Microsoft and Atos play to make sure that the disenfranchised communities understand how to join the conversations and how to have the conversations in a way that they can be heard? And often we don't think that's the case, but I know that's something that has been very important to you, Heather. So I was just wondering if we could talk about that real briefly before we end.
Sure. And I'm glad you're the one asking me the question, because, the answer might surprise everyone else, but I don't think it'll surprise you. And it's amplifying storytelling. And that essentially is what we're doing with the Microsoft AI for Accessibility program. We are providing lots of examples where AI can be used for good to solve societal challenges for the disability community. And when corporations like Microsoft and Atos get behind the disability community, talking about the impact of the product, service, technology, what have you, that is a totally different framework than Microsoft telling you that story. You really get the human need of why that technology is needed, and you really get the impact. And so it really is simple, which is why I love amplifying other people's stories. Last week, we had one of the projects that we're working on with Northwestern and Mental Health America and University of Toronto, where they're looking at democratizing access to mental health solutions through something that's pretty low tech. Text messaging, but it's backed up by a really fancy AI algorithm that can deliver mental health and behavioral interventions right when you need it based on how you engage with that app. So just to really figure out, okay, what is going to work to continue to engage this person and develop this new behavioral pattern and habit. And this is for the benefit of lots of people that are wary of going to a therapist. And so thinking about how we can reach people where they are, but then to hear the impact of the story of Mental Health America talking about how anxiety screenings went up 400% during the pandemic, and depression screenings went up about 800%. And the fact that, this was mental health was the number one in growing disability before the pandemic. But those numbers tell you, hey, we got a heat map going on here. Hey, we need some solutions today. And so I love the concept of really thinking about what accessibility has always done, which is when you solve for one, you extend to many. And I love that about this community, and I love that about the stories that we get to tell with the community using technology.
Fantastic. I think that's, and Deborah is not the only believer in storytelling here. Actually, you're in good company. Okay. I think storytelling is immensely powerful, and the way to connect to people is authentic. And I actually need to give my authentic thanks to you for being our guest, for being part of our community, for being a great ally, for working in tech. I need to thank my ClearText for keeping us captioned. Microlink and Barclays Access for also supporting us over the years to keep us on air. We're now in our 7th year, 13+ billion impressions on Twitter and counting. So thank you, Heather. I'm really looking forward to the chat on Tuesday night on Twitter, or Tuesday lunchtime for you. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much. So much gratitude. Thank you all.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you.